Today's event is particularly exciting and particularly timely. We have a great lineup of speakers, and our moderator, Ishaan Tharoor, is a foreign affairs writer at the Washington Post, where he writes Today's Worldview, a daily column on global affairs. We're pleased to have Ishaan take part in an MEI panel for the first time. He'll introduce our expert panelists and lead the discussion from now until 1:30. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for coming today. Please join me in welcoming Ishaan Tharoor and our speakers.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Firestein, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to the Middle East Institute for giving me the opportunity to moderate this very interesting and exciting panel. I sit at the foreign desk in the Washington Post, and this year it feels like we've been on a kind of endless election treadmill with no sign of it stopping. And for us, it does feel often in terms of the commentary that the fate of the liberal order is permanently suspended in the balance. And in that context, we haven't, the subject of the Iranian elections has perhaps fallen a bit off the general radar. But it shouldn't, and I'm really excited now to have the opportunity to discuss the May 19th vote with our three panelists. Let me do a quick introduction of them all. I believe their full bios are presented before you on your seats. Nazila Fathi is an Iranian-Canadian author and a former Tehran correspondent for the New York Times. She's reported for Time and the Agence France Presse as well in Tehran, and is the author of The Lonely War, A Personal History, interwoven with Iran's experience since the 1979 revolution. She was reporting in Iran till 2009. Alireza Nader is a senior international policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. He's a prolific commentator on Iranian politics and author of The Days After a Deal with Iran, Continuity and Change in Iranian Foreign Policy, as well as other many deeply informative reports under the aegis of the RAND Corporation. Alex Vatanka, to my left, is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, specializing in regional security affairs with a particular focus on Iran. Alex is also a senior Middle East Studies fellow at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School and teaches as an adjunct professor at the Defense Institute of Security Corporation Studies at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was previously an analyst at Janes. I think I'd like to begin the conversation with Alex. Whenever there is an Iranian election about to happen, there is a strain of commentary, particularly in this country, that immediately says, oh, it's another election in Iran, this election doesn't matter, Iran is a theocratic state after all. So I guess the first question is, why does this presidential election matter? And then moving on beyond that, could you tell us a bit about the major conversations that have dominated this election campaign and what President Hassan Rouhani's chances are for re-election?
Great. Thank you, Ishaan. Thanks very much, all of you, for coming. If I may, let me take that in reverse and talk about, the challenges that incumbent President Rouhani is facing, and then we get to, I guess, the more consequential issue of does it matter for the United States? Should we care who wins or not on 19th of May? As an Iran watcher, the last few weeks has been pretty interesting to just see how the debate in Tehran has evolved. And the last few days alone has taken a very sharp turn away from what you could call sort of the decent conversation within the regime about what ought to come from these elections to something that is perhaps going to move in the direction of an unpredictable vote on the 19th of May. Look, end of the day, I think what President Rouhani has to deal with is the fact that he's no Mohammad Khatami. And these elections are not elections of 97. This is, in the eyes of ordinary Iranian voters, not an election about choosing a different path from the last many years since the Islamic Republic came to being in 1979. Your average Iranian voter knows that the presidency is only one power in the power structures of the regime. You got the unelected powers, the office of the Supreme Leader, obviously by Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, and then the generals and the Revolutionary Guards who have oftentimes more say than the president has. That isn't just true for Rouhani, that has been true going back to probably the mid-1990s. Certainly was true for Ahmadinejad, and as I said, was true for Mohammad Khatami. But in '97, Mohammad Khatami came in as a guy who really gave the Iranian people real hope. I mean, there was a genuine sense in Iran that whoever wins can take the country in a different direction. That's why they came out and voted for him in the percentage that they did. 70% roughly voted for him in '97. That's huge. 7 out of 10 people voted for this guy that barely, very few Iranians knew. I mean, he was a former culture minister, but he comes in and sweeps the floor. And the reason for that, the only reason for that was he mobilized. He mobilized the silent majority of the Iranian voters. The silent majority, if you want to call them that, really have become only more cynical because of what happened to Mohammad Khatami. They gave him that huge mandate, they expected him to turn things around, and he didn't stand up to the Supreme Leader Khamenei. So who is not up for re-election? Who doesn't really run for office? That's the Supreme Leader. So you could be cynical sitting here in Washington and say, so it doesn't really matter who wins. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But even when you consider the fact that of the 1,600 people who registered to run and 6 were selected, carefully selected by the regime, even among the 6, you do have real differences that can make a difference in terms of where Iran is going. And you could separate these two camps. Of the 6 individuals, roughly, I think you can put 3 of them in the so-called, let's call them, reformist moderate camp. That includes Rouhani, his vice president, Jahangiri, and another former minister from the 80s by the name of Hashemi Taba. And then you got the 3 hardliners in the other side. And if I could just, I don't want to talk too much, summarize it in this following fashion. One side, the Rouhani side, the moderates, are saying we have to make more concessions. That the nuclear deal of 2015 was necessary, but it could be a platform on which we can build on. And that's exactly what the other side is hitting him on the head with. They're calling him a compromiser. They're saying, when would your compromise-making skills come to an end? They're going after him for the nuclear program. They're saying, you promised us a nuclear deal, and you said the economy will turn around. The sanctions mostly are still in place. The economy hasn't turned around. In other words, you are a weak negotiator. Now, this is totally disingenuous on the part of the hardliners, because as everyone who follows Iran knows, Rouhani could have never cut a nuclear deal with the world powers if the Supreme Leader hadn't sanctioned it beforehand, which he had. But nonetheless, you have these two camps competing for power, and I think that's the key here for us to remember. It's about power. It's not really about ideas. It's about power. Two networks are facing off. And you can, as I said, throw in the third network, IRGC. But for the sake of this election, I think 2 of the networks are together. That's the circle around Supreme Leader Khamenei with the IRGC. They're in a marriage of convenience, facing off the elected president that has potentially millions of people behind him. The question for Rouhani is, how does he get people in and believe in him? Consider him as a Mohammad Khatami, because he's struggling with that. He is not a Mohammad Khatami. He's a foot soldier of the regime. He's never called himself a reformist. He's oftentimes been on the wrong side of the argument when it comes to the reformist sort of pet issues. If you're asking reformist students today, what was your impression of Rouhani before he became president? Probably very negative. He's basically a man who came from the military security apparatus. He is, as I said, someone who has loyally served Khamenei from day one. People forget, I mean, how did Rouhani get his career started back in 1979 when he showed up from the United Kingdom? As a 29-year-old man, he was asked for dinner one night by a man by the name of then Ali Khamenei, who later on became the Supreme Leader. Khamenei and Rouhani have known each other for that long. And in many ways, Rouhani owes his career to Khamenei. But today they have differences of opinion, and that's something that we will hopefully get to talk about, because it ties to the issue of the succession process, which is not what I was asked to talk about, so I won't get into it. But Khamenei, the Supreme Leader, is worried about what comes after him. He's 77 years old. He will be 78 this June. He does not want to see what happened to the last Supreme Leader, Khomeini, happen to him. What happened to Khomeini and his people, his network? They disappeared. They disappeared because Khomeini never cultivated a cult around him and an institution around him. Khamenei doesn't want to fall for that trap or in that trap. So what Khamenei is doing is has, for the last 25 years, created a formidable institutional sort of base around him. And he wants to make sure these presidential elections that are happening on 19th of May doesn't in any way mess up his plans for the succession process, because that's already surely being very carefully planned. But as I said, for Rouhani right now, the key is voter turnout. So if you look at Iranian news the last few days, what's he saying? What are the things that Rouhani has said that he didn't say the last 4 years, or certainly didn't say it in such a colorful language? He's gone after the Revolutionary Guards generals. Why do you write these slogans against Israel? He doesn't mention Israel specifically, but everyone knows when you write slogans on missiles, and if you're the IRGC writing those slogans, it's aimed at Israel. Rouhani comes out and says, we're breaking our backs trying to convince the world that we're not just a normal country, and look what you're doing. And what has the Revolutionary Guards, again, done in the last few days? They've gone on the offensive against Pakistan, told the Saudis will attack everywhere in Saudi Arabia except Mecca and Medina. The offensive by the IRGC right now is to kind of hit back at Rouhani as part of this competition for power. But again, I'll stop here just saying this is about competition for power. It's not so much about ideas. I don't expect if Rouhani gets re-elected that you can expect a different Iranian policy in Syria, or if the hardliners win, they're going to walk away from the nuclear deal. I don't think things of that nature are going to happen. And if we can expect any serious change, I think we should turn our eyes or attention towards domestic affairs as opposed to Iran's regional activities or foreign policy. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for setting us up with that. Alireza, if I can turn to you, first of all, just to segue, could you give us a sense of, for the ordinary Iranian voter, what does the nuclear deal mean to them at this point? And then after that, I'd love you to give us a greater sense of the other candidates in play and the kind of political fractures that are shaping this election.
So I would venture to say that for the average person, the nuclear agreement has been a big disappointment. Rouhani, 4 years ago when he ran for president, ran in a country that was really facing a crisis. And he did rescue Iran from its crisis. He negotiated a nuclear agreement. He got many of the sanctions against Iran eased, not completely lifted. So he was in good shape 4 years ago because he offered a lot of hope. And if you remember, his motto was the key, that he saw himself and his presidency as the key to solve all of Iran's problems. 4 years later, yes, Iran's situation has arguably improved. The economy has improved a little bit. Iran is down under severe international pressure. Its regional position has improved probably, I would say, tremendously compared to 4 years ago. But in terms of the economic benefits, the average person is not seeing a lot. Oil production and export is back to pre-sanctions levels, but that doesn't really create jobs. And Iran hasn't seen a lot of foreign investment come in because of the banking sanctions and a number of other factors. So while I would agree with Alex, and just in general, the commentary about Rouhani that he's in good shape, I wouldn't say that his election is guaranteed, actually. I think there's a good chance he might not be reelected. And that's because a lot of people might not feel compelled to go vote. And there's a phenomenon in Iran called the white ballot, and that's people who, instead of voting for any candidate, leave their ballot blank as a protest against the system. So we could see a lot of white ballots. According to some estimates, 20% of the voting population might vote for nobody. And if Rouhani faces that dilemma or situation, if people don't turn out to vote for him, if they're apathetic, then he could very well lose. And what that means, I think, that is that Ibrahim Raisi, the main conservative candidate and the rumored favorite of Ayatollah Khamenei, and the rumored successor to Ayatollah Khamenei, could win. Not because he's popular, not because A lot of people are enthusiastic for him, but because if a lot of people don't vote for Rouhani and the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij and the conservatives mobilize their supporters to go vote for Raisi, then he could very well win, or actually at least make it into the second round of voting. And there's already discussion in Iran of Rouhani having to go into a second round. The first election, he didn't have to go into a second round. He won by a slim majority. This time might be different. And I think Raisi has been really groomed for the past year or two for a high-level position, whether that is a position of the leader or the president. He is right now the head of the Mashhad Shrine, which is Iran's biggest and wealthiest shrine. He has held a number of important positions in the Islamic Republic, including Attorney General and Deputy Head of the Judiciary. He is favored by the Revolutionary Guards. A few months ago, he just had a big meeting with the Guards. He's very much hardline on social and foreign policy issues. And for a while now, he's been rumored to be the successor to Ayatollah Khamenei. And I wonder if the regime feels confident that he can win the presidency, and after Khamenei dies, then he will be elevated to the leadership position. The way Khamenei succeeded Khomeini, Khamenei was president before he became the leader in 1989. I think the biggest challenge Raisi faces is the fact that he's associated with the 1988 mass executions of political prisoners in Iran. A lot of information has come out on that issue recently, and it's a big topic of debate in Iran. And I think a lot of people resent Raisi for the executions. It's a topic that hasn't been very public, but has become more so. And also, Raisi lacks charisma. His first TV interview wasn't that great, according to commentaries in Iran. So he has a number of challenges, but I think in Iran, to be successful, you don't have to be popular. And I think his lack of popularity and the fact that he's pretty unknown in Iran and untested in an elected position actually could be to his benefit. Frankly, we don't really know how the people of Iran feel. Public opinion polling shows that Rouhani could be in trouble, and a lot of people might be apathetic, but we can't know for sure. And then the other candidates, I'm not going to go into detail. The most major one is probably Ghalibaf, the mayor of Tehran, who's a perennial candidate. He could be a surprise conservative pick, and I think he has a chance of winning the election. But I would rate his chances as being lower than Rouhani or Raisi.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alireza. I think that gives us a neat segue to Nazila. Could you tell us a bit about, yes, the implications for the Supreme Leader succession, and why would it suit the Supreme Leader to have a hardline candidate defeat Rouhani?
First of all, I have to say that I agree with a lot of things that have already been said. It's really hard to put a couple of Iranians on the same panel and they would disagree with each other. I don't know why we have not found a solution to our problems, even though
you need an Indian to moderate.
Probably, probably. I also think that the biggest, the race is mostly between Rouhani and Raisi before I start talking about the implications for succession. I think this election is particularly important because Khamenei is 78 years old. And the chances of him passing away within the next 4 years are much higher than any time in the past, especially because it's been rumored for a long time that he is ill, he has cancer, and something might happen to him. And the names of many other people have come up as possible successors. Sadegh Larijani, Shah Rudi, but there has always been stories that have come up and sort of tarnished those possibilities. Corruption allegations have been the most common ones, and people believe them. And to have a supreme leader who's had a reputation of being economically corrupt does not sound very plausible in the Islamic Republic, especially because when Khamenei came to his position, he didn't have that kind of reputation. Number two, I think this elections and whoever becomes the president is going to be more important because somebody like Rafsanjani is not in the picture anymore, an influential power broker who was so important in getting Khamenei appointed as the supreme leader. First of all, when Khomeini was alive, a lot of clerics, a lot of torchbearers of the revolution were much, much younger. The assembly that got together, assembly of experts after his death, had a lot of clerics on it who were close to Khomeini, who were very loyal to the values of the 1979 revolution, and they wanted to see the Islamic Republic with all its values to survive. Khomeini had a designated successor. He'd seen succession that far, even though Montazeri was dismissed. Quickly, Khomeini assigned a team to revise the constitution so they could forecast the powers that his successor could have. We don't have any of that now. We don't have somebody like Rafsanjani who would be influential, who is somebody who could forge alliance with different forces to decide who's going to take or what kind of people, because the Constitution also allows a council to succeed Khamenei. And number three, which I think is the most dangerous thing, is the power of the Revolutionary Guards. The Guards have never been this powerful in the history of the Islamic Republic. We know that in addition to political and economic ambitions, they also have regional ambitions. I mean, it is the Guards that is meddling in the region. And they are under the control of the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Without him, who knows what kind of role they will play in the political future of Iran. And now, why is the president important, the next president, Rouhani or Raisi, as we are assuming one of those are going to get elected? According to the Constitution, Article 111, the president will be part of a three-member council that will take over all the duties of the supreme leader until the council of experts can appoint the next leader or leaders. The other two members are the Chief Justice, Sadegh Larijani, whose name was flaunted as a possible supreme leader, but again, there were corruption allegations against him. And also one of the six jurists of the Council of the Guardian Council. So they will be responsible for all the decisions that normally the supreme leader would make. Now, if Rouhani gets elected, and I think if there is a large turnout, he has a much better chance because people are afraid of the other candidate. I mean, I got a tape recording today on my text message, and this is something that Iranians are constantly getting. I mean, they tell me they get a message related to the elections every few minutes. A conversation between Montazeri and Raisi in the late 1980s. And Raisi was trying very hard to persuade Montazeri to give him permission to execute 200 political prisoners. And Montazeri kept on saying, no, I'm against that, that's against my personal opinion. And Raisi kept on insisting. It was a 3-4 minute recording. And of course, Montazeri's voice is very recognizable. I don't know if the other person is Raisi, but ordinary people who listen to these things, they will be influenced by who this guy is going to be. And yes, his name is being flaunted as the next supreme leader. He didn't have a big public profile. Maybe him running in the elections is to test and see if he would be able to make it as a supreme leader. So if there is a big turnout, I think Rouhani has a good chance of winning, and that victory, that vote, would constitute another rebuke to the rule of the conservatives, including the Revolutionary Guards and the supreme leader. Rouhani would be a relatively heavyweight in that council of the council that would replace the supreme leader, who can forge alliance with other moderate forces. On the contrary, if Raisi gets elected, and I think he can get elected only if there is a very low turnout. As Ali said, I mean, there are certain kind of people who would be bussed in to vote for him. In 2009, even the conservatives' estimate was that they didn't have more than 10 million votes. So his chances, if the elections are not rigged, are not that high. But his victory, I think, would signal a totally different meaning for the future of the Islamic Republic, and that is that they are thinking of the future of Iranian politics, who's going to replace the supreme leader, and in what direction the country is going to move towards. And I think this can have regional implications, because a stable Iran is vital for the Middle East, considering how the Revolutionary Guards are playing a role in Syria and Iraq and other parts of the region. This election is going to have quite serious implications.
We'll get to the regional implications in just a sec. If I could just quickly follow up with you. You mentioned 2009. Is there any scenario where you could see a potential rigging in this? Do you see that as a likely possibility ahead of this vote? Obviously, it's very hard to tell. And I guess also a few months ago, at least recently, there was a lot of noise about the political resurrection of Ahmadinejad. He did not get put on the ballot. Do you read anything into that?
Well, I thought his disqualification was very interesting, and I thought it must have been a huge embarrassment for the Guards and for Khamenei, because they went to extreme lengths in 2009 to make him president. For anyone who was on the grounds in 2009, it was very obvious that the elections had been rigged. People were angry. The uprising was very genuine, and I think it did scare the establishment. I think the only reason that they went ahead with Rouhani's elections 4 years later and really respected people's votes was because they had realized, the regime, the Guards and Khamenei had realized that the regime would not survive without any legitimacy among people. They needed the minimal support from the people, at least on the surface. They had to pretend that they respected people's votes. Whether something on that scale would happen again, I think it can be suicidal for the regime. Iranians are very happy that the protests didn't go too far because of what happened a year and a half later in Egypt and in Syria and in Libya. But just look at what's happening on the social media. Iranians haven't become silent. That protest that went silent, began simmering beneath the surface, is now on social media. The way they go after every single candidate, I think Ghalibaf's is done. I don't think he has a chance of winning. The way they've gone after him, when during the debate there were these tweets constantly fact-checking what he was saying, and with evidence, people were saying that he's lying. The same with Raisi. They haven't gone after Raisi as fiercely as they've gone after Ghalibaf, and I think they are strategizing. They're trying to get rid of one candidate and then go after the other one. But the opposition is very active, is working very hard to get Rouhani elected. Jahangiri is in the race, is probably part of the tactic that they have. He's saying the things that Rouhani cannot say, the way he has embraced the reform movement. He's talking about Mousavi and Karoubi are very interesting, and the last minute he's probably going to withdraw from the race. So I have a hard time believing that the regime would go to the same length that it went in 2009, but who knows, because we've been wrong so many times.
Do you want to add anything else?
I would agree. I think it would be a big mistake for the Iranian regime to fix the election. I think they've learned their lesson. They know they can win elections in a different manner. But even I think if Raisi loses, he could still become leader. It's not up to the people to choose a leader. So it wouldn't look great for him if he lost the election, but it wouldn't be completely detrimental either.
I think in Iranian elections, you definitely do have plenty of space to do what they call election engineering. But you have to keep in mind the scale of which you have to sort of undertake to make it happen. One thing is to turn 500,000 or maybe 1 million votes from one to another candidate, or make it disappear, or do engineering. But anything beyond that is tough to cover up. And I think that is going to be the problem for the hardliners should the voter turnout to be up greater than it was last time around. I mean, Rouhani got about 18 million in 2013. That was about 3 million less than Khatami got in 97. And bear in mind, in that time frame, that 16 years, the population had gone up in terms of numbers, and yet Rouhani got less than Khatami. So his problem, as I said before, is will people come out to vote? And the only way they can come out to vote isn't because they love Rouhani. Look, as I said, Rouhani is a foot soldier of the regime. Everyone recognizes that. He has been very respectful of Ayatollah Khamenei's red lines throughout. He's never even to this day called himself a reformist once. He knows how to be a player. And for him to sort of mobilize the supporters that used to come out in the streets for Khatami in 97, in 2001, or the ones who came out and then some of them died in 2009, he needs to say something that will, basically say it's worth you coming out. It's worth you coming out to the streets because I'm a changed man. I think it's kind of late in the day for him to do that. And yet he has a chance to win because the other side's candidates are so terrible from the point of view of your average Iranian. Raisi, as you heard, is a man who basically seen with blood on his hands. Was he an executioner? He wasn't, but he was happily an operative and played a very active central role in those dark days of the 1980s, and people will hold that against him. And I mean, very quickly on Ghalibaf, I know my two friends here are dismissing him, and he's not doing well, but this is the third time he's running. He came second to Rouhani in 2013. He got about 6 million votes. So, I'm not so sure that we can just dismiss Ghalibaf. He's actually a much better of a candidate this time around as ever been. Raisi's second presidential debate was much better than his first presidential debate. But I totally agree, he's struggling. He doesn't have the charisma. He does seem to be getting more and more institutional support from corners that answer to the Supreme Leader's office, and that matters. And yet, I want to go back to my basic point. If you have a high voter turnout, if 20 million people come out, of the 50 million people who can vote, roughly, then there is nothing Khamenei and the Sepah, the IRGC, can do. If the voter turnout is down in the first round, you might have a second round, and in the second round, fiddling around with the votes can get much more easier to do because you can say with the voters that supported Raisi and Ghalibaf and Mir Salim decided to tactically vote against Rouhani. This is what happened to Rouhani's mentor, his second mentor in his political career, Ayatollah Rafsanjani, in 2005. How did Rafsanjani lose to a guy called Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2005? Because the voter turnout was down. And again, I want to make one other point on this. Every time Iranian voters are given a choice to choose between a sort of established candidate and the anti-status quo candidate, they go with the anti-status quo candidate. And it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who comes from the reformist angle. And the biggest example of that is the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2005, who arguably has been more of a challenge to Khamenei than any of these other reformist presidential candidates or presidents in the last few decades. Nobody's come as close to Ahmadinejad to stand up to Ayatollah Khamenei and say, you're not elected. I'm elected. I represent the people's voice here. Ahmadinejad is the only one that's come close to saying that publicly. He's paying the price for it. Rouhani's coming late in the game saying, I could be something like that, or I could be something like Khatami. I think it can only be convincing if people, average people, are scared sufficiently to say, okay, it's worth going out and vote for this guy. I don't hold my breath. I don't think he's going to do any miracles in the next 4 years, but I'd rather have him than Raisi or Ghalibaf.
Great. So let's talk about the regional implications. Maybe Alireza, let's start with you first. You know, Iran does have its hand in a whole number of conflicts elsewhere in the Middle East. The most significant, perhaps, would be Syria, where there's been a massive Iranian commitment of manpower, resources, blood to the conflict, and you've seen these kind of grand spectacles of funerals back home of various Iranian IRGC commanders and so on who've been killed fighting in Syria. So I was wondering, first of all, just will this election be a referendum on this conflict in any way, or how has the conflict shadowed the election?
I think that we can expect continuity when it comes to Iran's policies in places like Iraq and Syria and the rest of the region. Because if you look at Rouhani, he hasn't done anything significantly different than any other regime officials. And in fact, the wide assumption is that the Revolutionary Guards shapes Iran's policies in the Arab world. And if we look at who the most popular, or not so much popular, but high-profile figure is when it comes to Iran's foreign policy, it's Qasem Soleimani, who's photographed and videotaped going to Iraq and Syria and being on the battlefront. So I think whether Rouhani wins or Raisi wins, we can expect Iran to pursue its rivalry with Saudi Arabia, to push back against the United States in the Middle East. I don't see any big changes in that regard. I do actually think that if Raisi wins, Iran's attempt to improve relations with the Western world will be pretty much over. And Ayatollah Khamenei has really criticized Rouhani for reaching out to the West, and he's urged the other candidates not to pursue that policy. And once Javad Zarif is removed as Iran's foreign minister, if Raisi wins, then a key interlocutor will be gone as well. So Iran's policy toward the West could harden, especially if America's policy toward under Trump hardens as well. And if we think about Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's election in 2005, one of the reasons Khamenei favored Ahmadinejad in that election was the fact that Iran was under a lot of pressure because of the nuclear issue, and Khamenei believes that you meet pressure with pressure, not détente, which was Khatami's approach, and Khamenei really disapproved of that. So if U.S.-Iran tensions increase, I think a candidate like Raisi makes much more sense in terms of Khamenei's preferences on foreign policy issues. On the nuclear issue, all the candidates have said that they would respect the agreement. I don't think any Iranian president would be the reason for Iran to violate the agreement. My worry is that the United States actually would undermine the agreement much more so than Iran. And I wouldn't be surprised if Raisi wins, for example, then the two countries could face major disagreements on the nuclear issue. Even on very small issues that are not technically violations, they could be made into bigger issues because of tensions between the two countries.
How you said that your worry is that the U.S. would undermine it more. How do you see that playing out?
Well, right now the U.S. government is conducting its review of Iran policy, and I think that the wide assumption in the government right now is that the nuclear agreement hasn't been a success, that in order to deal with Iran, the U.S. has to really push back against Iran's regional influence. President Trump is traveling to Israel and Saudi Arabia as his first foreign trip, and I think Iran will be a major focus. And while the U.S. has said that Iran has adhered to the agreement, it wouldn't surprise me that in the future, if there are even minor violations, opponents of the agreement and the United States will really try to exploit those to undermine the agreement. Right now already, there are new discussions of sanctions being passed against Iran. For example, designating the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist sponsoring organization. That will not help the nuclear agreement because all along the Iranian government, at all levels, all factions have basically argued that the U.S. is trying to undermine the agreement through other means by passing new sanctions. And I think there's some validity to that, actually. There could be in the future.
Nazila, what does Iran's posture vis-a-vis the rest of the world, does its standing in the West, does that matter to the ordinary Iranian voter?
I think it does a lot, and I think that was Rouhani's biggest achievement. I mean, he made a promise to reach an agreement with the West over Iran's nuclear program, and it did. And for the very first time, first of all, the Islamic Republic got international recognition. It had reached an agreement with the outside world. And for the first time, Iranians felt very proud of what their president had done. And you know, one other thing that has constantly come up in Rouhani's campaign and also Jahangiri's campaign is reconciliation rather than confrontation with the outside world. And I mean, they know that this is on top of people's minds. I mean, for years and years, ordinary Iranians have complained that the Iranian passport has no respect. And I think was it Raisi who made a reference to that? I mean, even Raisi made a reference to it, that Iranians are not respected. Iran has become known as a pariah state. And the reason Jahangiri and Rouhani are raising this issue, I think it was today too, he had a big talk at Shirudi, am I right? Mm-hmm. And he talked about this again, that we want respect in the international community. Iranians are tired of being isolated. I mean, he uses terms like this, Rouhani. And these are things that people care about. I think it is still a little bit early to say which way the public opinion is going, because, I mean, the real public opinion is shaped not just the last week right before the election, but the 2-3 days before the vote. I mean, everybody tries to use their best cards on those days because they're afraid that the other side might come out and sort of ruin everything. So it is really the last 2-3 days of the elections that we can tell which way the public opinion is going. But for now, Rouhani is saying all the right things in a very, very cautious way. And Jahangiri is the one who's saying the things that Rouhani can't say that openly. But together, they are somehow embracing the politics of the reform movement without explicitly naming Khatami or Karoubi or Mousavi, but they have called for freedom of the two leaders. Apparently today or yesterday at one of the campaign headquarters, people started chanting, demanding the release of Karoubi and Mousavi. There were references to their imprisonment during the debate. So I think they will use those kinds of things that people care about, including Iran's standing in the international community, and try to get people come to the polls.
Do you want to add anything else, Alex? Or?
You know, I think one of the most interesting parts of the first presidential debate was when the vice president of the incumbent president said who was behind the attack on the Saudi embassy. And everyone knew what he was talking about, the so-called deep state. There is no deep state. It's the IRGC, Islamic Revolution Guards Corps, which is not elected. So that was the closest thing we came in this Iranian election so far, although we had more references like that in the second debate, and we might have more in the third debate that's going to happen on Friday, which will be probably maybe even the most interesting debate to watch because they will talk about economic issues. But the point is, he came out and said, who attacked the Saudi embassy? In other words, we, the elected government, oftentimes are not even aware of some of the things that are going on in this country. Never mind shape it. We don't even know they're happening. We didn't know somebody, a part of the so-called deep state, was about to attack the Saudi embassy. And we have then, Zarif has come out and called that a national treason. You know, that's an act of treason. So that in many ways takes you to the heart of what's at stake in this election. Are they going to break free from these very regulated elections and actually have a real decent debate They debate a lot of things openly on the economic front, sometimes even social, cultural issues, but certainly on the regional matters. There are so many taboos that, Rouhani doesn't want to cross. So on the question of Syria, I don't think Rouhani necessarily agrees what the IRGC are doing in Syria is the best way forward. Certainly, some people close to Rouhani are in trouble for openly coming and saying our Syria policy can't just be about more arms and intervention militarily in Syria. We have to think of a plan B. But Rouhani himself doesn't come close to saying that publicly. And I don't know what the analogy is, but it's like the self-censorship that drives us analysts mad. We know exactly what he's thinking in his head when somebody says, how come you're not doing things differently? And he says, well, I'm trying to, but you guys, every time we take a step forward, you do something that takes us 2 steps back. But Rouhani, as a foot soldier of the regime, has to watch his own red lines not to get into trouble. And that, unfortunately, limits the real healthy debate you would expect in any presidential debate. A couple of quick points I wanted to make about, is Rouhani going to get elected or re-elected or not? I don't know if this makes any difference, but since 1980, you've had 12 presidential elections. This is the 12th. With the exception of the first 2, everybody else has had a second term. And there's a lesson here. Why do they get a second term? If you believe in these elections in Iran being oftentimes engineered to an extent, not totally, but to an extent, the message from the second term election is one of continuity. The supreme leader wants continuity. Every time you have a change of a guard at the presidential palace, that brings a bit of change that might not necessarily be to the liking of the supreme leader. I wonder if that's going to be a factor in this case with Rouhani, who I said he might have issues with the supreme leader, but he is a known entity to the supreme leader. He's not going to pull Ahmadinejad off and surprise Khamenei, and that actually might save him and get him re-elected. Rouhani is... how would I say that? Rouhani needs to move and talk more about the real socio-economic challenges in the country. Mohammad Khatami's his big failure was he never talked about the socio-economic countries in Iranian society. That was his big problem. And Ahmadinejad came in and he spoke to the needs of ordinary Iranians, and that got him actually a significant amount of support. Rouhani has to do something similar to Ahmadinejad, but without being Ahmadinejad. But he has to talk about the real socioeconomic troubles that the country and the people are facing. He has not done so far. He's now basically cornered himself as the elitist mullah. The mullah who cares about buying Airbus and Boeing planes, but doesn't care about subsidies and handouts the way Ahmadinejad is so famous for. What is Ghalibaf hitting Rouhani with on the head? And what is Raisi hitting Rouhani on the head with? They are all promising 5 million jobs and cash subsidies from the oil revenue. These are the types of things they've borrowed straight from the Ahmadinejad election book. And Rouhani needs to play that populist game. It's not going to make much of a fundamental difference to his second-term presidency, but in order to get people out, he can't just talk about foreign policy, we need détente with the United States, we should reconsider our position on Israel. That is all great for the city folks in Tehran and elsewhere. Out in the countryside, they want to know, how am I going to feed my family? Ahmadinejad knew how to speak to that segment of society. Might be too late, but Rouhani can try and do some of that as well.
So speaking of opportunistic populism, President Trump is going to Saudi Arabia this month, and with Iran very much the subtext of the visit, you have an administration here in Washington that has made its line on Iran emphatically clear, and that has perhaps signaled that it's not really interested in seeing a slow evolution of the Iranian-U.S. relationship in the way in which the Obama administration perhaps was. How does the kind of, let's say, hardline position of the White House impact the kind of thinking about the U.S.-Iranian relationship in Iran? Maybe, Alireza, you can start with that.
How does it impact the election in Iran?
The election, and also just does it give more wind to the sails of hardliners in Iran as well?
I think so. I think the assumption in Iran right now is that the U.S. is going to pursue a harder line toward Tehran, and that the Iranian regime has to be ready for it. Even I think Rouhani wins again, he's going to actually have to toughen up when it comes to the U.S. if the U.S. decides to really push against Iran, especially regionally. I think one thing to look for right now is whether the U.S. will get more involved in the campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. There's a discussion of the U.S. helping Saudi Arabia capture a major port. So I think that's one arena where we could see increased tensions between the U.S. and Iran. And there have been even attacks against Saudi ships, allegedly by the Houthis using Iranian weapons and technology. Just imagine if one of those suicide boats or missiles hits a U.S. ship instead of a Saudi ship. What could happen to U.S.-Iran relations on the eve of the Iranian presidential election? So that could sway things quite a bit when it comes to elections in Iran. And I think Iranians in general are afraid that they're going to come under increased pressure economically as well, that new sanctions will be placed against Iran. And I think they would be right to assume that. And no matter how willing European and Asian countries and companies are in terms of trading with Iran, and I think there are indications that Iran-Europe trade relations have improved. Regardless, if the U.S. doesn't want Iran to become less economically isolated, it can do so. I mean, the U.S. Treasury Department, the U.S. Congress, the executive branch have very powerful weapons that they can use against the Iranian economy, and I think Iran's economy is very vulnerable to U.S. pressure. The U.S. might have a hard time pushing against Iran regionally, even if the U.S. becomes involved in Yemen. That won't necessarily mean the end of the conflict or a decrease in Iranian influence. But the way to counter that, I think, according to a lot of people in Washington today, is to increase economic pressure against the Iranian government, especially the Revolutionary Guards and people like Raisi who run large foundations that benefit from Iran's monopolistic economy.
Nazila, do you want to add anything about that?
Well, I think that might work to the interest of Rouhani. I mean, when you talk to people in Iran, economic inequality is the biggest issue on their mind: recession, unemployment. I mean, the fact that the threat of war has been deterred is a huge thing. But economically, their situation has not improved. Everybody's talking about inflation, recession, nobody can sell anything, nobody wants to buy anything. There is a 1% that is extremely rich, and then the 99% who is struggling. And, you know, Trump's rhetoric has scared people. I mean, a lot of people are afraid that there might be a war. I mean, or he might, do something with the nuclear agreement and increase tension between the two countries. I think that is something that might get a lot of voters to the polls, and that would be a good thing for Rouhani. When it comes to these things, threats that might impact people's lives, people do go to the polls. They do see themselves responsible for bringing about the little change that they're capable of doing.
Yeah. If I could answer that question, Ishaan, by first referring to something that happened at a domestic level and then turn it into what you said specifically about Saudi Arabia. In one of the presidential debates, Ghalibaf said to Rouhani, "You lied. You said you create 4 million jobs, and you haven't created that many or nearly as many as you said you would." Rouhani had to come back and said, "Look, I said," and this is true. I don't want to, as I said, I'm not a big fan of Rouhani per se, certainly don't see him as a reformist, but the man was speaking the truth when he said, "I said there will be maybe 4 million jobs. If we can bring tourists into the country in terms of 10 million per year, that's going to create a lot of new jobs." But he continues, and this is true, what happens when we open the door for foreign visitors to come in? What happened in the 1990s when first time Iran tried mass tourism, and there's a market for a good degree of tourism? What happened to those tourist buses in downtown Tehran that were being heckled by the hardline supporters, the Basiji types out there? And that is basically what we have here. Which Iran are we talking about? The Iran of Ayatollah Khamenei and his supporters, or the Iran of the elected president pushed forward by an Iranian people that by and large wants to live in a normal country, do not want to be engaged in all sorts of adventures in the region, but that's what the regime elite class by and large is going for and pushing for. And that, if you're sitting in Abu Dhabi, if you're sitting in Riyadh, if you're sitting in Jerusalem, which Iran are you going to trust? The Iran that says, I want to be a part of the international mainstream, and you like Rouhani, you think he's great, but you don't think he can deliver? Or do you actually pay attention to the actions of the Revolutionary Guards? And that explains the cynicism that is present in the region about what to expect from Iran. So the Iranians are making all sorts of promises about how, the nuclear deal could be the beginning of something new, let's turn the page, and that's all great. But the Arabs, the Israelis, and the Turks look at Iranian action in the region. I'm not saying everything that's going wrong in the Middle East is Iran's fault. That is not my argument. But I'm saying there is a lot to be said about a neighbor that's sort of anxious about Iranian motivations and sort of sees two Irans at play and says, the Iran that I care about, should care about, is what Ali mentioned before, the Iran that is home to Qasem Soleimani and not the Iran that, Rouhani wants to represent. That duality, in many ways, they are their own worst enemies. They cannot act in unison as a nation state. There is no Iranian national interest today. That's the tragedy of Iran. This country with so much potential, there is no Iranian national interest. Factions have taken over, only preoccupied what's going to hit them in their pockets, how they're going to maintain power, and they couldn't care less about the country of Iran. That's the tragedy of Iran today.
Like a lot of countries.
Right, yeah, well.
I think it's a great moment we put a lot on the table. We'd love to get some questions from the audience. So just raise your hand and I'll identify you. Yes, you, sir, in the front. Please identify yourself as well.
Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion. Michael Kurtzik, who used to work on the Iranian desk at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Could you speak for a moment to what's going on the campus and what the women hope to get out of this election, what the college people and universities hope to get out of it, and what will their reaction be, depending on who the candidate, which candidate is elected? Thank you.
Sure. Should I take it? Yeah. Very quickly, so my colleagues can also respond. Again, as I said, Rouhani's coming late to this somewhat, but he's going for the female vote and the minority vote. I mean, he's openly talking about how Sunnis in Iran are discriminated against. That's unusual. That's a very sensitive topic, but he's brought it up in a presidential debate. So he's trying to go out there and capture as much vote as he can, and appealing to the sort of intellectual, the so-called reformist-minded class. They're always going to vote for him anyways if they had to come out and vote. The question is, will they be coming out? And that's the big test. Will they be coming out? The turnout is going to be key.
Any other thoughts on
Well,
campus?
I think people in Iran, what they hope to get out is to escape the crushing pressure of life. I think a lot of people are under tremendous pressure. Yet, I question whether anybody in Iran really is naive enough to think that any presidential election will really help them at this point. Because people voted for Khatami in the hope of improvement. And then they voted for Ahmadinejad, who turned out to be a disaster. And then voted for Rouhani, who hasn't really done very much. And so what is the next person going to really do? That's why I really think there is a huge amount of apathy in Iran when it comes to elections. Yes, people are afraid of Raisi, and that might motivate them to go vote for Rouhani, but that doesn't really translate into belief in elections as really benefiting them.
No, I totally agree. I mean, one thing that happened after 2009 was that universities as hotbeds of activism were almost completely silenced. And it has never been able to get back to where it was in the late 1990s. But of course, I mean, students at universities, whether they are from urban areas or from rural areas, actually, students who were from rural areas were much, much more outspoken, more liberal than kids from big cities. They all favor the more reformist candidate, and they were very active. There is not much activism, nothing compared to 1990s or even early 2000 going on.
Go on, Nick.
I just wanted to make one comment because you mentioned the campus and Nazila mentioned 99. The one moment in 99 when those militiamen ran into that University of Tehran campus and started beating people up, and which led to some casualties, that was a breaking point in many ways. That was the first time the Revolutionary Guards generals publicly said to an elected president, you do this or we'll take over. That was the first time IRGC showed its political appetite for power. But that's a different story. Who was the individual who came out and gave the most famous speech relating to those events and said, we will crack down if we have to? It wasn't, no, it was Hassan Rouhani himself, who was the Khamenei's, at the time, represented the Supreme National Security Council. And that is Rouhani's problem today. His past is coming to haunt him. How can he convince the reformist camp to come out for him? That's his challenge, because they remember speeches like that he gave in 99, and that probably gives him some doubt. But hopefully, as I said, we'll find out soon enough what this turnout will be. And I always find turnouts to be the most exciting part, because when you get 80% turnout in Iran, last time I was in Iran for an election was 2005, we didn't have 80%. When we get 80% like Khatami did in 97, that just sets the country on fire.
Alex, I want to add, you're right. He came out and said we have to execute a couple of these student leaders, and then everybody else will go back to their homes. Rouhani said it publicly.
Right.
But one thing we have to know today is that Rouhani has a son who would be among the protesters if something like that happens again. So, that's how things are changing in the Islamic Republic, and they have changed over the past 35 years. Let's go back to Rafsanjani. 2 of his children served time in prison. When Faiza Hashemi was released from prison, she went and visited the families of Baha'i prisoners who were her cellmates in prison.
Right.
That was the biggest red line in the Islamic Republic. So things are that fluid. With all the torchbearers of the revolution either dead or now in their 80s and 90s, their children are totally different people. They are the ones who will make the future of Iran, not their fathers.
But then people like Raisi also, their children are going to fight those children.
The numbers are smaller. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yes, you ma'am, on the right-hand side, or the left-hand side.
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Very good presentations. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about the appeal of populism in Iran now. People went through the Ahmadinejad period. They got their cash handouts. They saw the hyperinflation that resulted. I've seen some remarks about people warning about if Iran goes under a populist or had stayed under a populist, it would be like Venezuela now. How savvy are people in terms of resisting these appeals from Ghalibaf and Raisi, promising them to triple their cash handouts and that sort of thing?
Can I go for that?
Sure.
I think populism was an important reason Ahmadinejad got elected, but the other reason a lot of people voted for him, a lot of people who didn't have political affiliations, was because he was not a cleric. Mm-hmm. And the regime knew that, and that's why they had him as their candidates. They knew that people were sick and tired of clerics, and that was why Rafsanjani lost to him. Populism can be a very, very important card in Iranian elections, but I think Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has ruined it for at least a couple of years in Iran. And Ghalibaf tried to use that. He said exactly everything that both Karoubi had tried to play that card too. Karoubi and Ahmadinejad had said. But it didn't work. There were all these tweets that were coming out and immediately rebuking what he had said, how it wouldn't be possible. With the economic situation, populism should work, but it all depends on who is representing it.
Can I very quickly, Barbara, you know this, but there's a perception problem in the Rouhani camp. He is the head of a government that's the oldest in the history of the Islamic Republic. These guys are old. But Ahmadinejad, again, this is not in defense of Ahmadinejad, but he did give young people a chance to come into government. Rouhani's brought people in who are young. Trouble is they were young in the 1980s when they first entered government. And they're still in government. Many of them have made real well for themselves in the Islamic Republic. And they are now the mullah elite. And that mullah elite will always create anger out in the countryside, and they're going to sort of resent that, and that's exactly what's happening. If Ahmadinejad was allowed to run, he probably had a decent chance of beating Rouhani. I mean, this is a sad thing for me personally to say, but that shows you the depth of socioeconomic anger that's in Iran today.
And I don't think populism really matters in this election because the people who have been chosen to participate as candidates have been very carefully vetted. And we talk about the guards not liking Rouhani and him being the more moderate candidate, but I think he's very acceptable to the regime as a whole. So for the Revolutionary Guards and Khamenei, if their plan A is Raisi, their plan B, Rouhani, is okay too.
In the back, please.
Hi, thank you for your insight. My name is Zara Sadiq. I'm a member of the Women's Freedom Forum, a member of DPI of the United Nations. In the past 20 years, we've been working on the plight of women and human rights in Iran, in the region, and specifically in Iran, human trafficking, addictions, and executions in Iran. Almost 40 years now, we have gone back and forth between reformist conservatives, pragmatists, and hardliners. I started with Khatami, then 8 years of Rafsanjani, the moderate one, then 8 years of Khatami, Ahmadinejad, Rouhani. Now is between most likely Raisi and Rouhani again. I guess my question is that what is really a criteria for the world, for experts yourself, the media in general, or in the West, to really consider one as a moderate or a conservative hardlines? Because let's be very realistic. At the end of the day, it is the supreme leader who's going to take out whomever that is supposed to win out of his hat. That is the reality in Iran. The addiction is raging. A 17-year-old boy goes on the grave of his father and slit his wrist simply because of being so poor and desperate. The prostitution. Those who have been in Iran, and I'm sure you have contacts in Iran, as obviously is known, what are your thoughts as to what the West can do? We are talking about, as I think Mr. Nader or Mr. Vatanka, you were this one that said, it's all about power. At the end of the day, it's about power and the maintenance of the establishment, regardless of who goes or gets a title of the presidents, and regardless of who has been occupying the White House of either party. The last almost 40 years, it seems that it's been a status quo, and it's the Iranian people and the Middle East, people who have been paying the price in millions, obviously. With the lifting of sanctions, the Boeings or the airplanes have been sold to Iran. They are transferring the Revolutionary Guards and Afghans and foreign fighters to Syria, slaughtering and holding Bashar Assad in place. What do you think should be or would be the policy, or look at it from a different angle as to what we really need to do? And we can debate on this back and forth as to who's the moderate, who's the conservative. The end of the game is that the establishment is in place, and what can be done to actually help the people of Iran and the region. Thank you.
So,
I mean, I can answer it this way, if I may, very quickly. I think, and everybody on this panel's mentioned that. and these are regulated elections. And we had a wonderful infographic up here earlier, which I should have pointed out. I didn't, I'm sorry, but it showed 16, thousands of people can decide to run, but as you are pointing out, the Guardian Council, who only answers to the Supreme Leader, who's not elected, decides who can run, who cannot run for office, or which legislation is good legislation, which legislation is bad legislation. So that is true, it's regulated. But as I was saying, even within these regulated elections, you still have distinct messages, oftentimes on issues that actually also matter, particularly in this case, domestic matters. I mean, if Rouhani wins versus Raisi wins, it might have a difference in terms of social freedoms that you might find in Iran. I mean, it might even go back to the days of Mohammad Khatami, where you had chances of a more free press, for example, which, you know, Ahmadinejad killed off. But, you know, you do point out something that, again, I hinted at. There is a set of red lines, and those red lines, if they're crossed, you're going to be punished for it. And that arguably is the end of the Iranian democratic experiment. It's so regulated at times that it cannot, unless Khamenei decides tomorrow to wake up to be a very different man. As long as he stays to the course he's been on the last quarter of a century, you can't expect major shifts in policy. I agree with you on that one.
I totally agree with everything that you said, but unfortunately it's out of our control. I mean, first of all, it's not our decision what's going to happen to the establishment. I think that's something that will ultimately be decided by people inside Iran. And from my experience as a reporter on the ground was that, especially after what happened in Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, Iranians do not want any kind of institutional breakdown, and they want the change to come slowly. And they are aware that the speed is too slow, and they are frustrated by it. And everything that you said is happening is true. I mean, apart from the fact that we are confronted with a political system that is very repressive, we are also dealing with a society that is transitioning from being a very traditional society into being very modern. So a lot of things that are happening in terms of addiction, prostitution, people's religious practices. I mean, a lot of it is something that has happened in any other country, any other society that has been transitioning. So, you know, I don't have a definitive answer for you. I mean, all I can say is that the Islamic Republic has changed. This is not the same regime that was in place when Khomeini was alive. This is not the same regime that was around in the 1990s. It is very different. It is not even the same country when I was there. I mean, when I see videos of music bands on the streets playing, I'm shocked. When I was in Iran 10 years ago, you couldn't hear music so publicly. I mean, live bands on the streets, that's new, that's different. And people are happy about these kinds of changes. So I don't know what to tell you. I just hope change will come.
I mean, that's the hope, that the Iranian civil society will push the regime in that direction.
I think we should.
Just wanted to say, under Rouhani, like over 5,000 youths are under death penalty right now. And Raisi, as all the members have mentioned, was on the death committee of the 1988 massacre. So what do you think, like in the West, how should it be approached besides this as to who might win or which conservative or
Well,
moderate?
I don't like the term moderate or whatever that's often used. But in response to your question, there's very little the United States and the West can do to change the overall situation in Iran, especially when it comes to human rights. I mean, yes, a lot of pressure could be applied against the Iranian regime, whether it's economic or political. You know, people argue that the European countries who want to trade with Iran should make human rights a precondition. And I would like to believe that could be successful, but I have major doubts about that. I don't think the Islamic Republic is interested in improving human rights. Maybe the reformists once did, but they're long gone. They've been sidelined. I think one thing the U.S. can do is not to make the situation worse. because the U.S. can do a lot of things to make the situation worse. But I don't necessarily think the U.S. can really improve conditions within Iran, because if we look at history, American attempts to do any sort of social engineering or intervention in Iran have largely failed. And I think the major reason for that is because other U.S. interests trump human rights, whether it's a nuclear agreement or Iran's foreign policies. And B, frankly, I just don't think the U.S. has the knowledge or the means to really shape events. It's entirely up to the people of Iran, and that includes the Islamic Republic, because frankly, they're Iranians as well, whether we like to admit that or not. Will the system change? You know, I am surprised at how durable the Islamic Republic is. Its demise has been predicted many times, but it keeps going, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that that go beyond the, repression or the economic monopoly in Iran that the regime wields. A lot of it has to do with Iranian society as well, Iranian history, and the people. I'm hopeful Iran will change, but my dad always told me, it won't happen in my lifetime, it will happen in your lifetime. Well, I'm not sure if it will happen in my lifetime, but I hope so.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and you sir in the front.
Why don't you take two?
Sure. Let's just do one quick fire round of very brief questions. Anybody else? You sir in the front. Anybody else? And ma'am in the back, and you sir in the back. So 3 questions.
Dr. Nader Gohari, I'm the President and CEO of Global Risk Intelligence. I'd first like to thank the panel for this fascinating discussion. And I was just wondering whether the panel would please be so kind as to elaborate as to the role of the IRGC within Iranian society today, and whether we've seen an evolving role since its inception.
Okay, that's one.
Hi, thank you again. I'm Danusha Huba from the State Department. My question is about Ebrahim Raisi. Since he's been touted as a potential successor for the supreme leader, I'd be interested in your opinions about how his presidential run affects those chances.
Thank you. My question is to Ms. Fathi. You mentioned you've been reporting from Iran. Have you been in Balochistan?
Excuse me?
For the Justice Panel, have you
to
been in
Balochistan?
Balochistan?
Oh, yeah, several times.
Could you let people know about it?
Okay, so we have 3 questions, one of which we've not discussed, but the other 2 I think we've sort of largely talked about already. Nazila, you want to answer about Balochistan? Then Alex, would you want to talk about the IRGC and how it's revolved? And we can circle back on Raisi and what he represents with Alireza. So Nazila?
Yes, I went to Balochistan. I can't say many times, but definitely several times. I also went to other deprived regions, to Khorramshahr, to Kurdistan. I wasn't allowed to go to Ilan for very obvious reasons. Unfortunately, I mean, these areas are the most deprived areas. I mean, no development work has been done. Khorramshahr, well, I haven't been there over the past 10 years, but when I went, I think 2006 or 7, it was still a war zone. I mean, buildings, broken wreckages of homes with signs of bullets on them. Sistan Balochistan, we were told not to go out after dark. It was so dangerous, even though downtown Balochistan was very busy, but we were warned that we do look like outsiders. We might get kidnapped. I went to the border, and we had an escort of several soldiers with us with machine guns when we went to the border with Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Islamic Republic has not invested in any of these minority areas. I think the policy has been similar to the policy before the revolution, that, I mean, these minorities, let's keep them weak, let's keep them underdeveloped, let's not empower them because they might pose a threat. And today, I think they are angrier than ever. They might be a threat in the same way that they were for a while after the revolution, but of course, the Islamic Republic went after them with an iron fist. It is very sad that at this day and age, There are still areas in Iran, which is a mid-income country with a relatively good oil revenue, and it can do a lot in these areas. I mean, Kurdistan was terrible, terrible. I mean, you just pass from Kermanshah and you get closer to Kurdistan and you feel as if you're in a different country. It's like the difference between Iran and Afghanistan. Obviously, they have prevented any kind of developed work in these regions.
Do you want to talk about the IRGC?
Sure. Who doesn't want to talk about IRGC? I'm not sure exactly where you wanted to go with, and I hope I cover it in my answer, but you're looking at a network of young men who oftentimes, if you go back to the 1979-80, came from very humble backgrounds, both urban and rural backgrounds. I mean, people like Qasem Soleimani and the head of the IRGC today, Mohammad Ali Jafari, come from central Iran, very poor backgrounds. They were not part of the haves in Iranian society. And what the revolution provided them was a chance to have a career. And they got on that bandwagon, and they're still on it, and they don't want to get off. And actually, it's become a bandwagon that if you're in their way, they will go right through you. And that's my point about IRGC. IRGC today likes to sell itself as the heroes who fought against Saddam's army in the 1980s. They defended the country. That's their narrative. We fought, many of us died. We have a right to be part of this regime. And if anybody like Mr. Rouhani and somebody else comes in and says, change your ways, we will resist. And they see it within their right to resist. And they resist in different ways, mostly very opportunistic ways, and as I said, oftentimes in ways that harms Iran's own national interest. And I think ordinary Iranians are very much aware of it, but they fear the reaction if they speak up, and there's a reason why the IRGC has 3 separate intelligence services. They watch everything you say. I mean, they are more powerful than the regular intelligence services in Iran, but they're protecting their own interests as opposed to necessarily Iran's interest. In other words, they are the formidable force that they are today, but they have a very close network. They know each other. They've been brothers in arms for about 4 decades, and they want to keep what they have. And then we hear somebody like Rouhani, or even Ahmadinejad for that matter. When Ahmadinejad started talking about reform, they pushed back against him in his second term as well. So they're about looking after number one, and that is something that unfortunately Rouhani hasn't tackled as frankly and forthrightly as he could have. I mean, he's called them out a few times. Ahmadinejad was the one who came closest to calling them my brother smugglers, stop smuggling, because you're harming the economy. In other words, long story short, it's a force that's looking after itself. It's a force that engages in adventurism and says what it's doing, for instance, in Syria is Iran's national defense strategy, which I think is very questionable. What they're doing in Syria is about IRGC's own specific agenda, which has nothing to do necessarily with Iran's national security interests. So I think overall, it's an organization that has become very used to this political power that it has amassed over the last 4 decades. And unfortunately, in Iranian society, there is not enough pushback against them. There's not enough pushback against that IRGC narrative, and the fact that they control so much of Iran's media today also doesn't help to create that kind of condition for a healthy debate about what is the IRGC up to today, some 40 years after it was created by Khomeini in 1979.
Alireza, do you want to wrap it all up with the IRGC and then Raisi's candidacy?
I think that the Revolutionary Guards will be a key player in who succeeds Khamenei. And look, Raisi might be the preferred candidate for Khamenei, but it might not really even matter as long as somebody like Khamenei replaces them. It doesn't have to be Raisi, it could be Larijani or Shahroudi, but I think the system gets to decide who becomes a leader after Khamenei, and not just Khamenei. And by that I mean that Khamenei's network, people within his office, especially the Revolutionary Guards, if I would pick one institution in terms of picking the next leader besides Khamenei, besides the Office of the Supreme Leader, would be the Revolutionary Guards. The Assembly of Experts, all other players are rather marginalized on the issue. They're powerless. So yes, even if Raisi loses the presidential election, I think he's still a candidate, but I'm not sure if that really even matters ultimately.
Well, on that happy note, I really want to thank the panel. It's been a terrific panel. Thank you so much for your contributions, and thank you all for coming. And thank you to the Middle East Institute.